Hello, folks. This is Shippy the Explorer, with the man with the Gordy and the gourd and the bush seed, and I forgot the name of this one. If you know what the seed is, I just recently saw it in Jamaica, but I don't remember what it is. But this is Shippy the Explorer, welcoming you back to the station. Um, I'll we are embarking on the old time story and the stories from back home in the Caribbean, whether you're in Jamaica or in the other islands in the Caribbean or Central America, and any area that is as that is that is that is was affected by colonialization and European, the connection between Europe and Africa, and then the Caribbean or the Central and South and North America, then you have experienced some of the the involvement of an interrupting stories between Europe and Africa and the Americas, and it's a lovely experience. Some of us we probably don't understand it, but it has affected us for all these years. The colonization and intermingling with cultures, the clashing of cultures and language and food and all that. But I'm embarking on talking to you specifically about some of the olden days. We started about the olden days. The main topic is olden days were golden days with a question mark around it. And you're probably saying, what is all this about? But I'm here to, Shippy the Explorer is here to explore our minds and bring you back to the olden days of when things were. And because I'm trying to actually take our minds off of the current affairs of this world, but bring you back to the old days of, in the whole back country where some of us are from, and some of us are still there. But things are evolving and things are changing. So today's topic is talking about why did grandma have so many 14 kids? Why did grandma have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 kids? And in one case in my family, the one man grandpa had 33 kids. 33 kids. And, well, they're out of Clarendon or, St. Elizabeth. Well, those are family that don't want to mention the name. But here we go. So, most of the grandfathers back then, of our age, say calling, for instance, Mass Joe and Miss Jane. Mass Joe, JJ. Mass Joe was probably born in... Well, my GoPro stopped, folks. Sorry about that. Let's go back to... So Mass Joe was probably born in 1898, and Jane was probably born in 1900. And by 1914, they met and they started having their babies. And by 1914, they had the first one. And in the space of, by 1930, 36, 1940, they have had their lot. And what is going on? What was going on in those days? Well, we'll talk about, yes, so much. So it's part of, it may be part of the religion. As far as I understand it, or understood it back then, you would ask grandma, why they had so many kids, and you would hear some of them talk about how the fact that God gave them to me, and we're supposed to have our lots. But which part of the Bible? The only part of the Bible that one of the parts that I came up with is Genesis 1 to 28, where it says, "Be fruitful and in and increase. Be fruitful and increase in numbers." And that's the only one. So it was a sign, it was an understanding that if you are, God gave you the ability to have kids, then you just go ahead and have them, as many as your womb could produce. And but so yes, but there's a reason for that. Also, it's not only biblical, because if you didn't have two parties get together, you wouldn't have so many kids. And sometimes you think of the poor mother, and how they were able to feed all those kids. Be fruitful and increase in numbers. Genesis 1:28. My golly. But the olden days, grandma and grandpa, they're having 1, 2, 3, 4, and sometimes twins in that space. And but when you really examine the whole thing, it's the one and the number one thing is religion. Because when you look at some of the old biblical stories, it's like you have Abraham and the Sarah, who she couldn't have babies, and it was looked upon. These mothers were looked upon with shame, and discuss that they couldn't produce babies. They couldn't have kids. So when you have a mother who was able to get pregnant and produce her firstborn, and she wrapped them up in her swaddling clothes, and you locked your way in the room for 3 months, man. 3 months. You're talking about these days when the mothers are having babies in 3 days, and in 3 days you're kicking you out of the hospital. In 3 months, you have the midwife that would come around and help you have the baby. And then you're locked in the room, not to see the day of light or the light of day for 3 months. And that's how, when you emerge from that room, then you have a lot of times a 3-month-old baby that is kicking and crying and sucking and doing also the things that a 3-month-old will do. So religion played a part in it. But the cultural thing is also that out of slavery, we had Mass Joe, who was 1898. He was just 30, 1830 something in the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica. Slavery stopped in 1834. Then they had an emancipation period in 1838. And say in 1840, 50, 60, 70, 80. And he's now maybe the first or second generation out of slavery. So slavery, the remembrance of the cultural experience of slavery was still strong. And Mass Joe, where was closely tied or attached to that culture. So he was most likely, he was, say, you could call him a farmer. We're gonna relax and take these guys as farmers, and he's a subsistent farmer, and he goes out in the field early in the morning at 5 o'clock, and then by 10 o'clock, Miss Jane would bring him some food, or he or the other helper workers, and they would bring him some food, and then that would be the first meal of the day, and then they would rest, and then they rest until probably 12 something or 12, and then they go at it again in the field, and then they stop sometimes in 3 4, and then they will come home. And what would be the entertainment? What would be the entertainment for these things, guys? Remember, a lot of them wasn't able to read. And if they were able to read, then they would probably read their Bible and some kind of paper, newspaper if they had it, or some book. And then they would wash their hands and their feet, and then Miss Jane would give them the meal. And then they would gather in the hut, as we talked about in the previous thing, in the one-room hut, or if they were more affluent or had more resources, they would probably have a two-room Wacklin Dab or tongue and groove board house. And he comes in, and the night is coming on to them, and the crows, not the crows, but the cocks are letting out their last crow for the night before they start. The birds and the chickens, they start to go on the roof, and they hear cluck, 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 and they're gone up in the trees. And Mass Joe and Miss Jane, they draw into their rooms, and they say their prayer. And remember, all he did was to wash his feet and wash his hands and maybe face. Sometimes there's nothing to do with bathing in the week. And he draw into the room, and the night overcomes the day. And there's darkness, and there's a lamp, kerosene lamp. And I just imagine they just turn it down, and they they crawl into their kaya mattress, and they cover with their thick blanket made out of flour bag. Or if they're richer, they'll have a sheet and all that. And then the warmness and the contact. And there we go. We can only imagine that there was love and contact in the midst of all of this. And maybe, remember, she just had a baby 8 months, 9 months ago. And here she is. She's ready. She's receptive now for another baby. And here we go, the love and the lack of the lack of entertainment and maybe radio and storytelling and reading and games has led to the bedroom where there is contact and the prospect for another child. And oh, and behold, in 3 months, another 3 months or 9 months, or sometimes some babies, sometimes two babies are born in the same year. One is born, say for instance, in December, or January of 1 year, and by December 20th of that same year, Miss Jane is giving birth to another child, because she's receptive that God says, have your lot. Have your lot. And she's proud that she's able to give birth. And so we have talked about the religious part of it, and we are talking about the social economical part of it. And and we have talked about the aspect of slavery. And here we are, Miss Jane and Miss Joe, they repeat this action year after year, and in 10, 20 years, they sometimes end up with 14 kids. 10 to 14 kids. And they're happy. Because the first child is now 14 and 15, and that child is now able to help Miss Joe in the field. Or if it's a girl, she helps the mother in the house, in the household. But all kids, all hands on deck. 14, 12, 10, 8, they're all in the field working. Because that's what slavery, the great triangular slavery brought out in these people. That you have as many kids as possible because you need the extra working hands in the field, and you're having these kids as fast as possible so that you can have people to help you to plant the peas, to hold the ground, to cut the grass, for the pigs and the fowl and the horse and the donkey, and for the goats and the cows. Extra hand, because slavery had conditioned their minds to go with the flow. And then they pack up in the Sunday morning, and they put on their one best suit. And maybe in the olden days they don't have shoes, but they are lined up, they're marched off to church, and they line them up in the front pew, and I'm telling you, line them up in the front pew to show the rest of the members of the church that Miss Joe and Miss Jane can produce. But there's a downside to this, where when they finish with Sunday school and church and they go on home, then the Sunday meal was prepared or is being prepared, and they tend to have a good meal on the weekend, because remember, Miss Joe is a farmer, and he's producing his yams and his bananas and his chickens, and they have their eggs and all that. And then if a lot of chickens are around the place, then it's a special Sunday meal. Then they would probably kill one of those cock. We call them cock, the roosters, because you have 3-4 cocks, chickens running around the yard, and the young ones are fighting against the older ones. And so you look out for the one that is making trouble, and you slaughter that bird for the Sunday meal. And then you fatten up the main whole cock for Christmas, and that's when you have that meat. And I'm telling you, when you kill that whole rooster, when you look at the meat, there's no fat, and if the little fat you have, it's just melted in your finger, and and the leg, the hip of the cock looks like beef, and the leg looks like chicken, and the breast looks like fish. It's all over the body. It's like it's different types of meat that's inside that whole rooster. In comparison to these modern day chickens. These modern day chickens now, they're just fat, and one constant concrete look at the meat. It's pale and tanned and full of fat. But back to the meal of the old days with grandma and grandpa and the many children. You cook that meal, and where you have his ground provision, and sometimes the weekends you get some of the finer things of life. You get the some rice, and you buy some peas, or you get some peas from grandpa's field, and you make your rice and peas with your coconut milk and your spices from the backyard. So you realize you don't have to buy, a lot of times you don't have to really be purchasing a lot of things. So that's the question. You're saying, how did they take care of 14 kids? Day in, day out, they're taking care of 14 kids. Because they're subsistence farmers. And a lot of times they are producing their own hyperchloric starch foods. And they're getting their vegetable from the fields. And then they buy maybe some of the whole slavery food, whole slavery fish. Let's talk about some of those whole slavery fish and thing. Can you remember? You're old enough. What did they send into the shop to buy? Chop and Son penny yard, 1 6, a quarter pound of salted codfish, half pound of mackerel, a half pound or 1 pound. No, well, they don't buy a lot of red herring. So those of you who know the red herring, you don't buy a lot of red herring because that thing was toxic. It was bony, it was dry, it was salty, it had a strong flavor, and all you need with the red herring is the flavor in it. So you buy maybe a quarter pound of that, and you mix that. And then there was one called shad. Telling you, bringing you back to the olden days. Olden days are golden days. And all those meals you would all those type of fish, one at a time. You'd probably use the codfish with the rundown, the coconut custard, and the pepper and the onion and the scallion, and with the food. And that's during the week. And of course, I said that the weekend you'd probably have chicken, and sometimes you have fish, because the fisherman would come around and sell their fish, or Miss Jane would go to the market and bring home some sprat, and then they would have sprat and all that. And once in a while you would have some maybe kingfish or snapper and all that. Once in a while. But during the week it's codfish or red herring or all these salted things that were a spring over from slavery. And then you cook the one pot full of yam and banana and sweet potato and dumpling. And then you have these aluminum plates. Yeah, I'm bringing you back to old days, folks. The aluminum plates, not necessarily we call them silver plates, but not the pure petrified plate. I think that's a word for it, but it's glazed aluminum. Plates. or bowls. And these were days just after when we were using calabash. We would cut the calabash and some people would eat out of the calabash. But Miss Jane, she would share the food and share out Master Joe's food first. And then the kids their portion were shared right around. And believe it or not, they had the end of the sharing, everybody's meal was there to be had. And then they are called in the kitchen and they get their own portion and they run out into the backyard. Under the mango tree, under the starple tree, under the guinea tree, under the mango tree stump, or some old stone down by the riverside, and they would be licking their fingers with that food because that's all they're having for the day. Now, let's talk about the fact that these kids, if you realize that the Mass Joe and Miss Jane, they're raising these 14 kids. In between, unfortunately, a lot of times, the pair have probably lost one or two or three kids who died in childbirth, unfortunately. But they're raising these kids. And that's by 1920, some of these kids are sent to school, they haven't started up kids 1914. So the 24, some of these kids are going to school and they're learning because it's another era. And they're sending some of these kids to school, but some of the boys, they're not sending them to school as much as possible. But the girls, they would send to school. Or they send them off to some kind of trade or to learn sewing and all sorts of things so that they can learn how to take care of themselves and their family when they grow up. Yeah, so it's a fact. So that's the reason I think why a lot of the families, they have a lot of kids in the olden days. Why did grandma have 14 kids? Because of religion, because of the lack of entertainment, and then the closeness of just one man and one woman who are receptive to love in their whole style. Nothing else to do but to have fun and breathe and bear the kids as God would allow. Yep. So, Shippy the Explorer is saying we're embarking on these stories to bring you back to old days and olden days of having, kids and how do you raise them and all that, and bringing you back to some of the old days to take your mind out of these current social issues. Shippy the Explorer is saying if you like these type of stories, like, share, and subscribe to the station, folks. So let's go and wrap up this tape because we're now looking at all these kids now being raised by one mother and one father. But in the old soul, you sometimes have aunts and uncles and friends, distant relative. So the old soul is big at all times. And you have to feed all of these people All of these people, God, He knows how big the pots were. God, He knows how they survived. But they did survive. Because we, as great grandkids, are here to talk about and talk about and talk about what took place back then, from what we saw and heard. Yeah. So things started to change. And society started to saying, you can't have so many kids, because the doctors start to come in the midst of it now, and the doctors said, telling and the midwives are telling the mothers and sometimes the fathers that it's a danger to have so many kids. It's not good for your body. Let's stop. Stop, Miss Jane. Try not to have no more, my dear, because this child, the next child, will kill you. Your body is weak, and going down, the next one might just kill you. And sometimes they don't heed to those advices, and sometimes they heed, and they survive. But when they don't heed, a lot of parents, a lot of old parents there, you hear that Miss Jane or Miss Daisy died in childbirth. The child is alive and crying, but the mother is dead. So now the man is there with 14, 15 kids and don't have anybody to look after, no woman to help. And who stepped in? Who will step in at this moment is friends and families and relatives. And one will take one or two, the youngest one or so forth. The families will take into their care the ones who they think would be more appropriate or beneficial to their family. Because as though Miss Jane is having kids, there are some women in the society who didn't have. It's like old Sarah in the Bible. She can't have babies. She tried and she tried and she tried, and she's embarrassed. So she take on one of these kids that are so happy that unfortunately the mother died in childbirth. And another one will take on the older kids. But sometimes the older kids would stay in the yard to look after one or two of the ones that are younger than them. But the young ones, they sometimes divide them up and distribute them into different homes. The 2-year-old, the baby goes up to street. The 2-year-old goes down to Uncle such and such. The 4-year-old goes to Auntie. And that type of thing. So you have the whole village taking care of the kids in those days. And so you often hear that you hear a child says their parents are such and such, but they were raised by such and such. But let's talk about the fact and point out the fact that things are changing as we go along from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And by 1950s and 60s, the numbers in the family, the amount of kids that the family had, they started cut them down to 6 and 5 and 4. And sometimes only 2. Because the parents now, the kids of those Master Joe and Miss Jane, they are now professional people. Sometimes they are teachers and they are nurses and things like that. They are farmers, and they are being told by the churches that and show an example that it doesn't make sense to have a lot of kids. It doesn't make sense. So with time, things change, and the days of having 14 and 15 and 16 and in one case that I know 33 kids, that I think it's off the that's a situation of the past, of the olden days, but golden days with a question mark. Shippy the Explorer is saying, if we can have the kids these days, have them not a lot. Look at your economical situation and have according to how you can afford the kids. So don't look at the 14 anymore, because these times and days are economically pressed times. Shippy the Explorer is saying bye for now. I'll come to you another time with another olden days or golden days story as we talk about another topic. So if you like these stories, like, share, and subscribe, because I might just have talked or spoken my tongue about families that are listening to my words. See you later. Take care and raise the kids accordingly. Bye for now.